My name is Irene Langston. I'm 39 years old, a memoir editor living in Seattle, and until recently, I was the wife of Dr. Caleb Langston, a renowned cardiothoracic surgeon whose name opened doors, whose smile charmed every room, and whose presence always managed to shrink mine. People often said I was lucky. "You landed him," they'd whisper with envy-tinged awe, and I'd smile, small and rehearsed, like I believed it too. We were married for 14 years. 14 years of Sunday brunches with his colleagues, carefully worded holiday cards, and silent dinners where the clink of silverware was louder than our words. We never had children by choice, or maybe by default. Our life was structured, immaculate, curated for display. Caleb always remembered birthdays, brought lilies home on Fridays, and never forgot to sign a card. He was flawless in the way a mannequin is flawless polished, untouchable, hollow. Then he died. A routine procedure, an unexpected complication. A surgeon losing his own life in the OR poetic. "Isn't it?" someone murmured at the wake. I didn't respond. I was too busy pretending to grieve the man everyone thought they knew. The funeral was grand, almost theatrical. A sea of black dresses, white roses, and soft organ music. People I barely recognized held my hand like they'd practiced the gesture. "He spoke so highly of you," they said. "He adored you." I nodded, smiled again. What else could I do? And then Mila, my younger sister, who'd always hovered on the edges of my life like an unfinished sentence, cornered me by the punch bowl. "Hey," she said too brightly, "did Caleb ever mention the investment account he told me I'd get a cut once it matured?" I figured now's the time. I stared at her. My husband had been dead for 48 hours, and she was asking about dividends like I'd just inherited a tech empire. "What account?" I asked. Flat. She blinked, smiled. "Oh, I guess he never told you." That was when the first thread pulled loose in the tidy fabric of my marriage. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered through the house like a ghost with no one to haunt. Every room felt like a set piece in someone else's life. And then I saw the small brass key hanging on a hook behind the kitchen calendar. I had never seen it before. Next to it, folded neatly, was a hand-drawn map. A red X marked a spot I didn't recognize 3 hours northeast, somewhere in the mountains. I held the key in my palm. It was old, weighty, no label. Just silence and questions. Caleb had always kept one room in the house locked, his study. Patient files, he'd said once, confidential. I had never pressed. I was the kind of wife who didn't press. But I wasn't that wife anymore. I wasn't that wife anymore. That thought repeated in my mind like a vow as I drove northeast, past the city limits, the highway giving way to winding forest roads. The key sat on the passenger seat, its weight oddly reassuring. Whatever lay at the end of this drive wasn't just about Caleb. It was about reclaiming something I hadn't even realized I'd lost. The forest thickened as I climbed higher into the Cascades. Pines lined the road like sentries, and the air turned cool, sharp with moss and memory. I followed the hand-drawn map Caleb had left behind, the red X leading me down a gravel road barely wide enough for my car. After 30 minutes of jostling over roots and stones, I saw it. The cabin was small, cedar-built, with green shutters and a metal chimney. It sat in a clearing ringed by trees, utterly silent, as if holding its breath. I stepped out of the car and stood there for a moment, watching. No smoke, no movement, but the porch steps were swept clean, and the doormat was free of leaves. The key slid easily into the lock. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and something warmer coffee. Maybe. The floor was swept, the furniture minimal but cozy. A tartan blanket draped over a worn armchair, a half-burned candle on the windowsill. Someone had been here recently, and often. I moved slowly, afraid to breathe too hard, afraid to break whatever spell the space held. A small kitchen with 2 mugs in the drying rack. A wooden dining table with a globe in the center, ringed by red pushpins. I followed them with my finger. Oregon, New Mexico, British Columbia. The globe spun slightly under my hand, like it remembered being turned often. The far wall was lined with maps, local hiking trails, national park brochures, and photographs. Dozens of them. Caleb in a wool sweater, grinning beside a woman with deep brown eyes and windswept hair. She was beautiful, serene in a way I'd never been. And beside them, in nearly every photo, was a little girl with a fierce expression and crooked smile. She looked maybe 10. Her hair was curly and wild, her eyes sharp. And Caleb, he didn't just smile in these pictures. He glowed. A warmth I hadn't seen in him in years radiated from every frame. This wasn't just a getaway spot. This was a home. Their home. My knees threatened to buckle. I found a chair, pulled it out, and sat. For a while, I just stared at the wall, at my husband's secret life, framed in 4/6 glossy prints. And then I saw the drawer. It was slightly open, a small notebook tucked just inside. I reached for it. The leather cover was worn at the edges, the pages dense with Caleb's familiar handwriting. July 18th. Zara asked if she could call me Dad today. I didn't know what to say. I told her only if she wanted to. She smiled and said, "I already do." Zara, the girl in the photos, his daughter. I turned another page. August 2023. Nina wants to take Zara to the coast next weekend. I told Irene I'll be in Toronto for the conference. I hate lying, but I can't risk losing either of them yet. I keep thinking I have time. Nina, the woman in the photographs, the woman I'd never heard of, the woman Caleb had built a life with while I made dinner at home, folded his shirts, reminded him to take his vitamins. He had always told me his work was demanding. Long hours, late nights, conferences out of state. I never questioned him, not once. I had been so proud of how independent I was, how much I trusted him, how little I needed. Page after page spilled the truth. 2 worlds, 2 women, 1 daughter, and a man slowly dying of heart disease, trying to tie invisible knots between lives he didn't have the courage to merge. At the back of the journal, a single page folded in half. I unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was a letter, dated 6 weeks before Caleb's death. Irene, if you found this, I'm likely gone. I'm sorry. For everything. I wanted to tell you every day. But fear makes cowards of men like me. I didn't know how to unbreak the lies, so I let them harden instead. There's a will. Not filed yet. Nina knows. Zara. She's innocent in all of this. So are you. The key opened more than the door to this cabin. It opens the truth. You deserve to hold it, even if you don't want to keep it. Forgive me. Or don't. But please, choose your own ending this time. Caleb. I folded the letter and set it on the table. The quiet of the cabin pressed in around me, but it didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt haunted. A board creaked beneath my feet. I looked down. One plank near the bed looked newer than the rest. I knelt, pried it loose. Beneath it sat a sealed envelope heavier than it should have been. Inside, a copy of the unfiled will, a notarized document naming Zara as his biological daughter, and a single phrase scribbled at the bottom. Tell her I loved her, both of them. And just like that, I wasn't a widow anymore. I was a question no one had asked. The words, tell her I loved her. Both of them still echoed in my head when I stepped outside the cabin into the sharp mountain air. I didn't know what I expected, maybe emptiness, maybe wind, but instead, I found a girl standing at the tree line, watching me. She couldn't have been more than 10, with hair that tumbled down in dark, unruly waves and a stance far too still for a child. Her eyes, though those sharp, slate-colored eyes stopped me cold. I'd seen them, in every photograph, in Caleb. She stared, not afraid, not curious, just aware, like she'd already sized me up, drawn her own conclusions. Behind her, a woman appeared, older than me, perhaps by a few years, wearing a windbreaker and boots, her face drawn but composed. She stopped a few paces back, letting the girl keep the lead. "You're Irene," the woman said. I nodded. "I'm Nina," she added, her voice smooth but firm. "This is Zara." Zara didn't look at me. She just kicked a pine cone at her feet and muttered, "She's the other one." I didn't speak. I didn't know how to respond to being a stranger in the life my husband had built without me. I was the ghost here. "I didn't come to make peace," Nina said, stepping forward. "Let's be clear about that. I came because Caleb made sure we'd cross paths if anything happened to him." She held out a small envelope, folded and sealed. I took it, wordlessly. "It's a key," she said, "to a deposit box, and a USB drive. I don't know everything on it, just enough to understand that it was meant for you." I kept my gaze on her face. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't hostile. She was resolute. Zara finally looked up at me then, tilting her head. "Did you know about us?" she asked. "No," I said quietly. "Good," she replied. "Then I'm not mad at you." It was strange the way that softened something in me. I had braced for anger, rejection. I hadn't expected a child to offer me grace. "We weren't hiding," Nina said. "He was—" "I know," I replied. We stood there for a beat. 3 women, tethered by a man who had woven us into opposite ends of a story only he controlled. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but none of them would undo the truth. "He said he loved you," I said at last. "Both of you." Nina flinched. "Barely. He said a lot of things." Zara tugged on her sleeve. "Can we go?" Nina nodded and turned back to me. "You'll want to look through what he left. Some of it won't make sense at first. Some of it might scare you. But it's all yours now. Irene." She started to walk away, then paused. "For what it's worth," she said over her shoulder. "He wasn't the man I thought he was either." And then they were gone. I stood there, holding the envelope, trying to feel like the person who was meant to receive it. But all I could feel was the deep, hollow space Caleb had left behind and how many lives it reached into. The drive home was quiet at first, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest like an apology. But that silence didn't last. About an hour into the descent, I noticed the car behind me, a dark sedan, low and clean. It kept its distance, never tailing too close, never too far. At first, I thought it was just another vehicle on the same winding road, but it didn't turn off. Not once. And every time I changed lanes, so did it. Calm, intentional. By the time I reached the highway, my hands were slick on the wheel. When I pulled into a gas station and parked, the sedan slowed at the exit, then kept going. A message, not a mistake. I replayed it in my mind, the man in one of the photographs back at the cabin, the one always in the background, standing behind Caleb and Zara, never smiling. He hadn't been a family friend. He hadn't even looked comfortable. He'd looked like a shadow. Watching. That man was now watching me. Back at home. I didn't go inside right away. I sat in the car with the envelope from Nina still clutched in my hand. Inside was the USB and a single index card. One word, written in Caleb's handwriting, Greyline. I didn't recognize it. Not a company, not a person, just a name. But something in my chest tightened. Some instinct I hadn't had the luxury of trusting during my marriage whispered this was bigger than just betrayal. This was danger. I carried the USB inside, set it on the kitchen counter like it was a ticking bomb. I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water with shaking hands and stared at the shadowed window. For the first time since Caleb died, I didn't feel like I was mourning a man. I felt like I was chasing his ghost, one that had no intention of staying buried. The USB sat untouched on my kitchen counter for nearly a full day. I circled it like it might detonate, unable to bring myself to plug it in. But the shadow of the dark sedan and the word Greyline written in Caleb's handwriting refused to leave me alone. Eventually, curiosity, no, need overpowered fear. I opened the drive on my old laptop, the one I didn't sync with anything online. The screen blinked. Then a single folder appeared for Irene. Inside was a video file, time-stamped 9 days before Caleb's death. He looked older. Not in years, but in weight. In his eyes. His shirt was wrinkled and his hair disheveled in a way I'd never seen it before. My heart seized when I hit play. If you're watching this, it means I didn't make it, or I ran out of time. Irene, you were never the one I needed to protect myself from. I just didn't know how to protect you from what I'd become involved in. He rubbed his face and leaned forward. The company's called Greyline Holdings. On paper, it's a development firm, real estate, venture capital, international logistics. But that's a front, a shell. The real business is money moving it, laundering it, burying it, offshore accounts, shell corporations, assets moved between ghost identities. He paused, his expression tight. I was brought in as a name, a face, a clean reputation to stand behind the dirt. I told myself it was temporary, that I was just a middleman. But the longer I stayed, the harder it became to walk away. I know that's no excuse. He looked down, then back into the camera. Victor Gray, he's the one behind it all. He's not just a businessman. He's dangerous, calculated, and he doesn't like loose ends. When I said I wanted out, he reminded me that Zara wasn't protected. My breath caught. Caleb's voice grew quieter. He told me that if anything I owned ended up in your hands, if you even touched anything tied to Greyline, he'd come for you. Or her. Or both. He swallowed hard. But I couldn't leave you defenseless. So I made a plan. The key you found unlocks more than just the cabin. It leads to a deposit box in Portland. I stored what I could: documents, contracts, evidence, and Irene. If you go there, don't go alone. The screen went black. I stared at it for a long time. By sunrise, I was in the car. Nina didn't ask questions when I called. She agreed to meet me at the Federal Trust Bank in Portland. Zara came with her, headphones on, tablet in hand, silent and distant. We said little on the drive to the vault. What could we say? The vault manager raised his eyebrows when he saw the key. Hasn't been accessed in years, he murmured, scanning my ID. Listed under a corporate name, Greyline Holdings. My stomach twisted. He led us through steel doors and corridors until we were alone in a quiet room. The deposit box slid forward with a metallic hiss. Inside a thick file folder, a zip bag, and a small audio recorder. I opened the folder first. Faked invoices, bank records from the Cayman Islands, passports under false names, contracts with signatures, Caleb's and Victor's. One document was particularly clear. It listed Caleb as the acting CEO of Greyline Holdings, despite no such title existing in any public database. This isn't just dirty money, Nina said, flipping through the pages. This is organized laundering, international scale. The audio recorder clicked when I pressed play. It was a conversation. Caleb's voice, low and tight. I told you I want out. I don't care about the money anymore. Then Victor's voice, smooth, unhurried. You should care. Because if you make this personal, if you get stupid and start leaving keys and trails behind, then we're not just talking about you anymore. You think I won't touch your little family. Your wife. That kid you're so fond of. A long silence. Then Caleb again. You don't touch them. Victor laughed. That's up to you. The file ended. The room was silent. My skin crawled. He knew, Nina whispered. He knew what this man was capable of, and he still trusted me to find this. I said, my throat dry. Nina turned to me, her eyes fierce. What are we supposed to do with it now? That was the question. If I turned this in, I'd be exposing a crime syndicate and endangering not just myself but Zara. If I kept it buried, then Caleb's death meant nothing. His fear, his plans, his warnings wasted. I closed the box and looked at them both. I think we find someone who knows how to make this matter, but quietly. Someone who can help us turn this into protection, not punishment. You mean leverage, Nina said. I nodded. Zara looked up then, finally pulling one earbud out. Are we in danger? She asked. I hesitated. Yes, I said, because I wouldn't lie. But we're not helpless. And for the first time since this all began, I believed it. We weren't helpless. I said the words for Zara's sake. But the more I repeated them in my mind, the more they hardened into resolve. I didn't know exactly what we were going to do, but I knew where I had to begin with the only person Caleb ever described as truly loyal, Dr. Malcolm Trask. I found his name in a hidden contact list tucked at the back of the will Caleb never filed. It was scribbled in ink next to a note, only if it all goes to hell. That seemed like an understatement now. Malcolm lived in the Queen Anne neighborhood of Seattle, in a converted townhouse above a private medical practice. When he opened the door and saw me, his face shifted from caution to a grief I recognized instantly. The kind of grief that carried guilt. I was waiting for you, he said quietly. He didn't invite me in right away. Instead, he led me to the back, through a glass door and into a quiet garden lined with weathered benches and old ivy. We sat beneath a tree heavy with spring buds. I always thought Caleb would outlive us both, he began. He was too careful, too controlled. He knew he was dying, I said, and still. He lied. Malcolm nodded. He lied to everyone, but mostly to himself. I pulled out the folder I had brought the documents from the deposit box, the USB, a printed transcript of the recording. I need to know if he talked to you about this. About Greyline. About Victor Grey. Malcolm studied the papers without touching them. He said it started small. A consulting favor, then a directorship, then investment funds tied to offshore accounts. Before he could untangle himself, they had him by the throat. I looked at him. Did you help him draft the second will? Yes, Malcolm said without hesitation. He asked me to ensure Zara would be protected, that if anything happened to him, there'd be a legal record, but he never submitted it. He was waiting. Maybe for courage. I hesitated, then asked the question that had clawed at me since the cabin. Did Caleb ever mention anything about an accident? Something involving Nina. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. He told me once that Nina had lost a pregnancy. It was early on, 2018, I think. There was a crash. Yes, I said, but what if it wasn't an accident? Malcolm went quiet. Then he spoke slowly. He said the brakes failed. The report called it mechanical error. But the strange thing was, she had the car serviced the day before, at a shop Caleb had used for years. I felt the blood leave my face. There was never any proof. Malcolm added, but he couldn't shake the feeling, especially when Victor started pushing him harder. Nina was scared after that. Started keeping Zara out of school. Stopped going out. He thought they were being watched. They had been, just like I had been. Back in my apartment that evening, I stared out the window, watching headlights move like ghosts across the street. Then I picked up my phone and called Mila. She answered on the third ring, her voice tense. Irene, we need to talk, I said, face to face. To my surprise, she agreed. We met at a restaurant downtown, the kind with flickering candles and private booths. She wore a red blazer and heels far too expensive for someone who claimed to be struggling. Her lipstick was perfect. So was her lie. I heard Caleb left some things behind, she said, sipping her wine. Anything I should know about, I smiled. Funny. I was about to ask you the same thing. She frowned slightly. What do you mean? I leaned forward. I mean the money Caleb invested in that shell property in Vancouver, the one Victor Grey helped finance, the same one you pitched to him, right before you gave him Caleb's private travel logs. Her face didn't flinch. but her hand tightened around her glass. "You always had it easy," she said quietly. "The perfect life, the golden husband, the house, the name. You mean the lie," I corrected. She shrugged. "At least you had something to lose." "You sold him out," I said. "For what, a foot in the door? I didn't think it would get him killed." "You didn't care." She looked at me, something unreadable in her eyes. "No, I didn't." I pulled out my phone, hit record, let it sit there on the table between us, the red light blinking. I already sent copies of everything to my lawyer. I said, "Try anything and it all goes public. The recordings, the documents, the ledger." She didn't speak, but her hand released the glass. I left first. That night, I met with Nina in a borrowed office at her friend's law firm. We laid everything out: USBs, documents, audio recordings, even my meeting with Mila. We made 3 encrypted copies. One for us, one for the lawyer, one in a safety deposit box under Zara's name. We also drafted a letter, a simple press release, every name, every account, every shell company listed, all tied to Greyline Holdings, all traceable. At the top, to be sent in the event of my death. The next morning, Nina and I signed it, and for the first time, I felt like the hunted had become the one holding the leash. The press release was signed. The contingency plans were in place. I no longer flinched at shadows or checked my locks twice before bed. That morning, I woke to a sky that didn't feel like it was pressing down on me, and that alone felt like a kind of triumph. A week later, I left Seattle. There was no grand goodbye, no announcement, just a one-way ticket, a rented moving van, and a box of books labeled "Start Over." I drove east until the clouds gave way to maples, and the damp gray faded into a softer, quieter light. Vermont greeted me with stillness and the scent of pine. I found a small cottage near Lake Willoughby, 2 bedrooms, 1 fireplace, and a porch that creaked in the wind. The landlord left me a jar of homemade jam and a note that read, "Hope you like the quiet." I did. The job came 2 weeks later, remote editorial work for a publishing startup in Montreal. Memoirs, poetry, essays written by people trying to find language for pain, survival, and reinvention. I didn't just edit their words. I heard them, understood them, because I had lived them, too. Most days, I walked the lakeside trail with a thermos of coffee and silence for company. Some evenings, I called Zara never too often, never out of rhythm. We talked about school, her new fascination with astronomy, and once about grief. "Do you miss him?" she asked. "I miss who I thought he was." I replied, "But I'm learning to let go of that version." She didn't say anything right away, then softly, "I miss him even though I'm angry." That's allowed. I told her, "You can love someone and still feel betrayed. The feelings don't cancel each other out." We didn't talk about Victor, or Mila, or Nina's quiet legal moves behind the scenes. Some storms we didn't need to chase, we just needed to outlive them. I kept a copy of the USB, encrypted and buried deep inside a password-protected folder. Not as a threat, not as a weapon, but as a boundary. A line drawn between my past and anyone foolish enough to cross into it again. I never filed charges against Mila. I didn't go public. Didn't call journalists or detectives. I chose silence, but not because I was afraid. Because sometimes, the most powerful move isn't to strike, it's to hold still while others squirm in the dark, wondering if the truth will ever come knocking. Let them. Let Victor sit in his glass office wondering if I've spoken his name to someone who matters. Let Mila check her inbox every morning with dread disguised as routine. Let the people who buried me wonder why they still hear footsteps behind them. That was enough. It wasn't peace, but it was power. A quiet, razor-edged kind that asked for nothing and took up space anyway. One afternoon, I returned home to find a package on my doorstep. No return address. Inside was a photograph of Caleb, one I'd never seen. He stood alone on a rocky coastline, hands in his pockets, eyes not looking at the camera but out towards something unseen. The wind caught his hair. There was no smile, just a kind of resignation. On the back, in Nina's handwriting, he gave me this the week before he died. I think it was his goodbye. I thought you should have it. I placed it in a drawer. I didn't need it framed. Caleb was a chapter I would never quite close, but I no longer lived inside it. I did not rebuild my life to erase him. I rebuilt it to find myself. And slowly, I did. I planted herbs in the windowsill. I repainted the front door navy blue. I let the quiet stretch across my days without trying to fill it. I did not date. I did not explain. I did not owe anyone a version of myself that fit their comfort. The woman who once stood outside the frame now owned the lens. And I knew, finally, that I wasn't here to prove anything to anyone, not to Caleb, not to Mila, not to the polished strangers at that funeral who had called me lucky. My value was never theirs to define. I never went back to Seattle. I didn't need to, because I no longer lived in the shadows of someone else's story. I had written my own ending, and more importantly, my own beginning. I did not need vindication, or an audience, or even understanding. I needed truth, and I had it now. Dignity, I realized, cannot be taken. It is not granted by blood, by marriage, or by silence. It is chosen, worn, protected, and it lives in every step you take forward after they expect you to fall. That morning, I pulled on my coat, opened the door, and stepped into the sunlight. I didn't look back.